In January of this year, the Prime Minister of Canada stepped before the assembled titans of global finance in Davos, Switzerland, and articulated, openly, on the record, without diplomatic hedging, what no leader of an allied nation had been willing to voice in the preceding 8 decades. The American era, the elaborate rules-based international order underwritten by U.S. hegemonic authority, is not undergoing a gradual evolution. It is not navigating a managed transition. It has fractured. It has ruptured. And then, rather than retreating from that declaration, rather than softening its edges with the customary diplomatic qualifications, Mark Carney descended from that stage and boarded a plane directly to Beijing, where he proceeded to finalize a sweeping trade agreement opening Canadian markets to thousands of Chinese electric vehicles, vaulting clean over Donald Trump's explicit threats of 100% retaliatory tariffs. Washington's institutional response was to categorize this sequence of events as minor diplomatic friction. Political theater, they said. A performative gesture from a junior partner seeking domestic attention. But that framing reveals precisely how thoroughly the American political establishment is misreading the situation, because what Mark Carney is executing right now, from the podium in Davos to the negotiating chambers in Beijing to the boardrooms of Sydney, is not theater. It is architecture. He is methodically constructing a middle power coalition whose explicit strategic purpose is to rout around the United States entirely. If you want analysis that actually connects these events into a coherent picture, without partisan distortion on either side, then stay with this breakdown. Because by the time we reach the end, you will understand the precise mathematical logic underlying Canada's defiance, the concrete reality behind the 51st state rhetoric, and why Washington is on the verge of losing something considerably more consequential than a trade dispute. To genuinely grasp the magnitude of what is unfolding in real time, to comprehend why the ground is fundamentally shifting beneath Washington's feet while the American political class remains absorbed in its domestic preoccupations, you must step back and examine the structural architecture of the world order that has governed international relations since the conclusion of the Second World War. The United States has operated, since approximately 1945, on a foundational assumption that can best be described as economic gravity. America is the sun at the center of the geopolitical solar system. Every other nation, regardless of size, wealth, or ambition, orbits around that gravitational center as a matter of structural necessity. This is not merely a claim about military predominance, though U.S. military capacity has certainly reinforced it. It is fundamentally about the plumbing of the global economy, the infrastructure through which commerce, capital, and power actually flow on a daily basis. It is about the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, meaning that most major international transactions are settled in American dollars regardless of whether the United States is a party to those transactions. It is about the SWIFT interbank messaging network, which functions as the circulatory system of global finance, and which the United States can effectively weaponize as a geopolitical instrument. And it is about a deeply embedded bipartisan conviction within Washington's foreign policy apparatus, a conviction that transcends administrations, parties, and ideological shifts, that if the United States decides to apply economic pressure to any given nation, that nation has no meaningful alternative but to comply, to apologize publicly, and to return obediently to its designated position within the American-led order. Nowhere has this assumption of American gravitational authority been more deeply ingrained, more thoroughly taken for granted, more entirely unexamined than in the relationship with Canada. Canada is, in many respects, the ultimate stress test of American hegemony. The two countries share the longest undefended international border anywhere on Earth. Their economies are so profoundly and intricately interwoven that economists have long deployed a specific idiom to describe the asymmetry. When the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold. The causal direction has always been presumed to flow southward to northward. America acts. Canada reacts. For decades, that presumption was validated repeatedly by actual events. The predictable cycle operated as follows. Canada would periodically register a polite objection to some dimension of American trade or foreign policy. Washington would apply measured pressure, a tariff adjustment, a diplomatic signal, a pointed comment from a senior official. And Canada, after a brief period of public discomfort, would quietly recalibrate its position and fall back into alignment. Reliable, predictable, reassuring to the architects of American grand strategy. Donald Trump's approach to this historically stable dynamic has departed from his predecessors in ways that are not merely stylistic but substantively consequential. Trump does not conceptualize alliances as mutual defense arrangements founded on shared interests and reciprocal obligations, nor as integrated economic zones constructed for the collective prosperity of their participants. His framework is transactional to its core. He views alliances fundamentally as protection arrangements, and not in the cooperative sense. In the extractive sense. Leverage, in Trump's strategic vocabulary, is not an instrument to be deployed judiciously in service of broader strategic objectives. It is a blunt instrument to be wielded as publicly and as brutally as possible, because the display of dominance is itself the point. When Trump returns repeatedly to the notion of Canada as a prospective 51st American state, the mainstream media apparatus consistently processes this as yet another disruptive soundbite, a geographical provocation, a passing insult calibrated for maximum domestic entertainment value. This interpretation is fundamentally incorrect. It is not a joke. It is a stated policy premise. The premise is this: you have no alternatives. The premise is that Canada's economy exists entirely at America's discretion, and that the threat of a 100% tariff wall is sufficient to induce immediate capitulation because Canada has nowhere else to turn. Trump surveys the map and perceives a vassal state that has temporarily forgotten the proper ordering of the relationship, one that merely requires sufficient pressure to restore compliance. He operates from the assumption that the classical laws of American economic gravity remain fully operative and are simply awaiting vigorous enforcement. For the better part of 8 decades, that assumption was essentially accurate. Which brings us to what transpired in Davos, and why it matters far more than the coverage it received. The World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, is not an environment that accommodates revolutionary sentiment. It is, by design and by culture, a gathering place of extreme institutional caution, the venue where the global financial establishment assembles annually to reassure itself of the order's durability and the system's fundamental soundness. The language deployed there is typically so saturated with diplomatic qualification and bureaucratic jargon that it carries almost no semantic content. Davos is where radical ideas go to be neutralized. Into this hyper-cautious, aggressively elite environment walked Mark Carney. For those unfamiliar with Carney's background and institutional pedigree, it is essential context. He is not a political firebrand. He is not an ideological disruptor. He is not the kind of figure who generates attention through provocation or theatrics. He is precisely the opposite, the individual summoned when genuine institutional competence is required in a moment of systemic crisis. He guided the Bank of Canada through the catastrophic turbulence of the 2008 global financial crisis with a steadiness that earned him international recognition. He then crossed the Atlantic to assume leadership of the Bank of England, where he presided over one of the most complex and contested periods in British economic history. He is the consummate institutional insider, a man whose entire professional identity is embedded within the very architecture of the Western financial system he has now implicitly declared obsolete. The speech Carney delivered at Davos was titled, with deliberate understatement, Principled and Pragmatic. And within that carefully constructed presentation, this paragon of institutional sobriety stood before the assembled global elite and, in essence, announced the termination of an era. He did not speak of a transition phase. He did not employ the diplomatic language of evolving relationships or shifting paradigms. He chose a word with a very specific and very precise meaning, a word that carries genuine weight in the lexicon of systemic analysis. He called the current geopolitical configuration a rupture, not a fracture, not a realignment. A rupture, implying a clean, irreversible break from what preceded it. Carney looked out at that audience and said aloud what allied heads of state have been murmuring to each other in private for the past 5 years. He called out American economic coercion by name. He identified American hegemony not as a system that serves global interests through the provision of stability and security, but as a structure that has progressively shifted toward actively punishing the very allies it ostensibly exists to protect. And then he delivered the line that will be cited in diplomatic histories for decades: "If we're not at the table, we're on the menu." Allow that statement to register fully. This is the leader of Canada, America's most intimate trading partner, its closest geographic neighbor, its oldest continental ally, standing on the world's most prominent international stage and communicating to the assembled global elite that the United States is actively predatory, and that Canada intends to resist that predation rather than accommodate it. He was declaring publicly, before every major investor, policymaker, and head of state in attendance, that passive reliance on American goodwill can no longer function as a viable strategic posture for any sovereign nation that intends to remain sovereign. Washington's reaction to this public declaration unfolded with the mechanical predictability of a script. The response was not a strategic reassessment of whether the current approach to allied relations was generating the desired outcomes. It was not a diplomatic overture designed to de-escalate tensions and restore productive communication. It was, without qualification, a sledgehammer. Trump immediately revoked Canada's invitation to a prominent international peace forum, treating a sovereign democratic nation with a casual contempt one might deploy toward a contractor being dismissed from a construction project for insubordination. He intensified the 51st state rhetoric, stating explicitly and on the record that Canada exists because of American forbearance. And then he deployed what the White House evidently regarded as the definitive instrument of coercive persuasion: the threat of a 100% tariff on Canadian goods entering the American market. This was the classical Washington coercive framework, simply calibrated to a more extreme register than usual. The logic embedded in the approach was straightforward and brutal: apply overwhelming economic pressure at maximum speed and visibility, manufacture immediate panic in Canadian financial markets, and force the political leadership in Ottawa to publicly retreat from the Davos position. The expectation was that Carney would issue a clarifying statement within days, something carefully worded to soften the Davos remarks while preserving a thin veneer of face-saving dignity. The expectation was shock and awe followed by compliance. Washington waited for the panic. They waited for the back-channel communications signaling a willingness to negotiate a quiet retreat. They waited for the clarifying statement about the enduring strength of the North American partnership. The statement never materialized. The panic never arrived. Mark Carney did not walk back a single syllable of his Davos remarks. Mark Carney did not request a White House meeting to seek tariff relief. Instead, he did something that left the American political establishment genuinely disoriented, because it was something their analytical framework had categorized as functionally impossible. He called the bluff. Carney departed Europe without traveling to Washington. He did not seek an audience with the administration that had just threatened his country's economy. He looked at the geopolitical map with fresh eyes, identified an available strategic option, and executed a move that directly and deliberately punctured the supposedly impenetrable American tariff architecture. Canada finalized a substantial trade agreement with Beijing. The specific terms: 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles, a category of goods that the United States has aggressively sought to exclude from North American markets through precisely the kind of prohibitive tariff barriers Trump had threatened Canada with, would be admitted into the Canadian market at a steeply reduced tariff rate of just 6.1%. The significance of this requires plain language explanation, because most mainstream coverage has failed to articulate the actual mechanics of what occurred. The United States has invested enormous political capital and deployed substantial economic instruments in an attempt to construct a continental trade fortress, a wall designed to exclude Chinese electric vehicles from North American markets and thereby protect the American domestic automotive industry from Chinese competitive pressure. This effort represents one of the central planks of the Trump administration's industrial and trade policy. Mark Carney walked up to the side of that fortress, located a structural access point, swung the door wide open, and formally invited the Chinese automotive sector inside. This was not an incidental bureaucratic adjustment. It was not a minor trade policy modification buried in the technical appendices of a routine bilateral agreement. It was a precisely targeted, strategically deliberate strike against the foundational assumptions of Trump's economic architecture. And it was Carney rendering his Davos argument tangible and operational in real time. The message, stripped of diplomatic packaging, was this: deploy tariffs as instruments of coercion against your allies, and your allies will locate alternative partners. Behave as an imperial hegemon, and your allies will construct systems that route around imperial authority. By finalizing the Chinese EV agreement in the immediate aftermath of Washington's tariff threats, Carney demonstrated empirically what Davos had established rhetorically. The 51st state actually possesses meaningful alternatives. The American economic threat is existential only for nations that decline to pursue other options. Canada had just proven, in the most concrete possible terms, that it was not among them. But the Beijing maneuver was merely the opening gambit of a significantly larger and more consequential strategic operation. The dimension of this story that the mainstream press has almost entirely missed is what Carney did immediately following the Beijing agreement, because that is where the genuine architecture of the emerging alternative order begins to take shape. Carney boarded a plane for Canberra and Sydney. On the surface, this appeared to be a routine Commonwealth bilateral visit. Two like-minded countries with shared cultural and institutional heritage conducting the standard consultations that maintain the relationship's health. Analysts who processed it in those terms fundamentally misread what was actually transpiring. In Sydney, Carney engaged directly with the leadership of Australia's largest sovereign wealth and pension funds, institutional pools of capital of truly enormous magnitude, and secured a commitment of $10 billion in investment directed toward Canadian infrastructure and energy development. This, in its operational significance, is the move. This is the middle power architecture rendered financially concrete. What Carney is constructing, deliberately, methodically, and with the kind of patient strategic intelligence one would expect from a former central bank governor, is a comprehensive alternative to American-centered economic architecture. He is assembling a critical minerals purchasing consortium among middle powers. He is advocating openly for what he terms variable geometry in international economic relationships, a framework in which nations build overlapping, flexible coalitions organized around shared interests rather than shared dependence on a single hegemon. He is working toward an AI sovereignty arrangement that preserves participating nations' ability to develop and govern artificial intelligence infrastructure independently of American corporate and governmental influence. And he is architecting a cross-Pacific investment framework that explicitly excludes Washington from its organizational center. When Carney and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese stood together in Canberra, the substantive content of their discussions extended well beyond the conventional categories of trade volumes and investment flows. They discussed strategic autonomy, a concept with a very specific and consequential meaning in the current context. Strategic autonomy means the capacity to function, economically and in terms of security, without relying on the United States as the indispensable guarantor of stability. It means building institutional infrastructure capable of sustaining national interests even in a scenario where American reliability can no longer be assumed. The two leaders are working toward a bridge connecting the Trans-Pacific Partnership framework with the institutional architecture of the European Union, a prospective trading bloc encompassing approximately 1.5 billion people and possessing sufficient collective economic scale to engage Washington from a position of genuine negotiating equivalence rather than structural dependency. Washington's current analytical posture assumes it is prevailing in this confrontation because it retains the capacity to threaten a 100% tariff. But as Carney observed in Sydney, the ability to monetize an indispensable position persists only as long as the indispensability itself persists. By systematically coercing allies into positions of maximum discomfort, the United States is inadvertently funding the institutional education that teaches those allies precisely how to construct viable existences without American participation. The profound historical irony embedded in this situation, an irony that deserves extended reflection, is that the America First doctrine is producing, with accelerating velocity, an America alone reality. The foundation of American global predominance was never primarily military. Military capacity was always the enforcement mechanism rather than the source of the system's coherence. The actual foundation was voluntary participation, the genuine decision by dozens of nations across multiple decades to build their economic and security arrangements around American institutions because doing so served their own interests. The dollar's reserve currency status, the SWIFT system's universality, the primacy of American financial markets, none of these were imposed by force. They were adopted because they were useful, and because the American-led order, for all its imperfections and asymmetries, delivered sufficient benefits to enough participants to sustain their continued engagement. What Trump's approach systematically corrodes is precisely that voluntary dimension. Every time an ally is treated as a protection racket participant rather than a genuine partner, the calculus changes slightly. Every time a tariff threat is deployed against a country that has not behaved adversarially, another set of policymakers begins quietly evaluating alternatives. The system's authority derived from its perceived legitimacy. Coercive power can maintain compliance for a period, but it cannot sustain the voluntary architecture that made American hegemony genuinely productive. Mark Carney is not primarily responding to a tariff threat or an offensive tweet. He is doing something considerably more consequential. He is removing the foundational assumption from the shopkeeper's window. He is ending the ritual of reflexive compliance, the automatic deference that has characterized Allied behavior toward Washington for 3/4 of a century. And as the perception of American indispensability begins its erosion, Washington may discover with growing alarm that a 100% tariff levied against a world that has completed the organizational work of moving on carries exactly zero coercive leverage. The American political establishment's failure to accurately read this situation is not primarily a failure of intelligence or information. It is a failure of conceptual framework. The analytical models through which Washington processes Allied behavior were constructed during a period when the alternatives to American-centered architecture were genuinely limited, when the dollar had no serious challenger, when SWIFT had no viable substitute, when the sheer scale of the American consumer market made exclusion from it functionally catastrophic for any export-dependent economy. Those conditions no longer obtain with the same absolute force they once did. The emergence of alternative settlement mechanisms, the development of competing investment frameworks, the growing institutional depth of non-American multilateral arrangements, none of these have individually displaced American centrality. But collectively, and in combination with a generation of Allied leaders who have watched the United States deploy economic coercion against countries that had done nothing to warrant adversarial treatment, they have created a genuine menu of alternatives where previously there was none. Canada, under Carney's leadership, is not betting that it can survive a full economic rupture with the United States. That would be a reckless and strategically unsound gambit, and Carney is far too sophisticated an operator to mistake courage for recklessness. What Canada is demonstrating is something considerably more precise and ultimately more dangerous to American interests, that the threat of rupture is no longer automatically fatal, that alternatives exist and are being actively developed, that the cost-benefit calculation of compliance versus resistance has shifted in ways that Washington's current models are not capturing accurately. That demonstration, if allowed to propagate through the network of middle powers Carney is assembling, could accomplish something that no individual nation's defiance could achieve alone. It could normalize the act of saying no to Washington. And a world in which saying no to Washington is normalized is a fundamentally different geopolitical world than the one the American establishment has been operating within for the past 80 years. Watch this space very carefully. The ground is moving faster than almost anyone in the mainstream conversation is acknowledging, and the distance between where we are and where we are heading is considerably shorter than Washington's current posture suggests it appreciates.